GraphQL is a data query and manipulation language for your APIs developed by Meta. And in this course, I'm going to show you how to use it with Spring Boot. It's becoming very popular and you should definitely learn how to use it so that if you have a situation where you need to use GraphQL, then you are ready for it. In this course, I'm going to show you how to build a backend API using GraphQL and Spring Boot. And then towards the end, I'm going to show you how to build the front-end UI using Next.js, React, and Tailwind CSS to consume that data. If you're new to this channel, go ahead and smash the like button as well as subscribe. Without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. This video will be split into two, where this one we're mainly going to focus on the GraphQL functionality and building the backend, understanding the query language, understanding types. And then the following video, I'm going to put everything together where we're going to build the UI on top of it. I just want to say that if you want to gain a certificate and take this course at your own pace, you can enroll to this course directly through our website, where every lecture and examples and links, including code snippets, will be available to you. Awesome. So for now, I'll see you in the next one. Let's begin our journey by understanding exactly how to work with Spring Boot and GraphQL. If you've taken many of my courses, you already know what Spring Boot is. So in this course, we're going to mainly focus on understanding what GraphQL is and then integrating it within Spring Boot. So GraphQL is a query language for your API, and it was developed by Meta in 2012 and open source in 2015. Now, it's been growing in popularity, and the main reason why you want to use, or one of the main reasons why you want to use GraphQL is because it provides efficient data fetching. It also comes with a strongly typed schema. And one thing which I kind of like is that there is no need for API versioning. So here you can see that sometimes say API v1 and then customers, for example. Then if you have a new version of your API, you have to deploy that version and then make sure that all the clients then start using the version 2 before you can actually deprecate version 1. So all of this goes away. These are some of the differences between GraphQL and REST. So with GraphQL, the client specifies the structure, where with REST, the server defines the structure. Then overfetching and underfetching. So GraphQL avoid both because the client can ask exactly what he wants. Whereas with REST, sometimes you might have a request that gives you way more information that you requested. And also sometimes you might need to get extra information by performing multiple API calls. With REST, there's multiple endpoints. So this is what I've just said in the last point. And with GraphQL, there is one single endpoint. No versioning needed, the payload size, minimal payload, and you only basically get what you requested. So this is for overfetching and underfetching. Then you have flexibility, performance. The learning curve is actually steeper and requires knowledge of the schema. And the tooling and ecosystem is actually growing. It's not quite there as REST, for example, but GraphQL will stay here. Let me give you a nice diagram so that you can see all of this. So basically, you have a client and you have one single endpoint, and then here you can actually have, a bunch of different servers connected to the database and whatnot. So the client only really needs to focus on one single endpoint, whereas here there's multiple endpoints. So maybe this is the endpoint for customer, this one is for transactions, this one is for payments. And with GraphQL, you can hide all of that under one single endpoint. So you can actually grab these slides and you can get this awesome diagram. And you can save it if you want. And this is an overview of what we're going to build, where we have a client that will perform a request using the GraphQL query language. So this is how you ask for data. Then that goes through the API, within our backend, we'll have the queries and the types, and then the response should look like this for the client. All right, so this is an overview of GraphQL. And if you have any questions, drop me a message. I'll see you in the next one. To get up and running with this course, what I want you to do is to clone this repository, which contains the main branch in here with the final source code, but also it contains the starter branch in here. So if I click on start, so this is where I want you to start your journey with Spring Boot and GraphQL. So go to this repository in here and click on code, and then grab the link. So this is the SSH link, and I'm going to clone to my clipboard. And in here, I do have IntelliJ, and IntelliJ is by far the best IDE, as you know, in my opinion, actually. And if you want to learn about IntelliJ, I do have a course on IntelliJ teaching you everything you need to know. So this is the course, IntelliJ IDEA Developer Guide, and it's about 10 hours covering both the new and old. And it's about 10 hours and it's about 11 hours covering the old as well as the new UI. So if you prefer the old UI, then it covers that as well for you. If you prefer the brand new UI, then yeah, so this course has been revamped. So here you can also see that you get a 1-year JetBrains all product pack. You get all the IDEs for free for 1 year. All right. So here, if I click on Toolbox, you can see that you get basically IntelliJ IDEA, Golang, Rust, Aqua, Fleet, PyCharm, WebStorm, CLion, DataGrip, basically all of these IDEs for free. All right. And if I scroll down in here, you can see what you will learn. So there's actually a section on AI and code completion in here, which is kind of nice. So let's now go ahead and open up IntelliJ once more. And in here, I'm going to click Get from VCS, and I'm going to paste. All right. Now in here, feel free to change the directory as well as the folder name. So maybe if you want to keep this as just GraphQL, for example, in here you can do so. All right. And also where it is stored. So in my case, I want to leave it under desktop. Perfect. Now I'm going to clone. Cool. Now let me close this in here. And if I open this folder, you can see that it contains few things, which we're going to go into in a second. But more important, what I want you to do is click on this button where it says main in here. And under main, open up remote. And then you should see origin main, which is the main branch that we are checked in. But here you should see a start. So what I want you to do is, so this is the start branch, which I needed to check out. So currently main contains the final source code with all the examples, including the UI. But for you to get started and follow along, just click on start and then check out. And to be honest, it's as simple as this. Perfect. So you can see that I can configure the plugin in here, which I'm going to close, and there we go. All right, so in here I do have the starter branch, which you can find in the description of this video. And essentially I'm using IntelliJ, and also I'm using the new UI. So if you want to switch to the classic UI, feel free to do so because everything is the same. But I feel like IntelliJ will start to use this UI more and more. And I just want to make sure that I give you both UI so that you can kind of get used to the new UI. So it doesn't really matter, as I said, but in here I do have this branch called start in here, and basically just check out this branch and you should get the project like so. So GraphQL, and this is a Gradle project. I chose Gradle. There's no particular reason because it's a simple project, so it doesn't really matter. And I will show you basically how everything will work very soon. And yeah, so in here we have the main folder, and then src, main, and then Java, and then GraphQL application with one single method. And this is the main method basically that starts the Spring Boot application. And then also within resources, we have some GraphQL stuff, which is empty right here. The static folder for static assets, templates as well, and then application.properties, which currently just contains the application name. So you can see that it's very simple. It doesn't have much. Now, in terms of the actual dependencies, so let me show you the dependencies, and these are found within build.gradle. So select that file, and let's have a look at this. So here, what I've chosen, so in terms of dependencies, so if I scroll down, so this is basically group and then version. This is Java 17, Maven, central repository. And let's focus on the dependencies so you see what this is. So what we chose was the Spring Boot Starter GraphQL, and also in here Spring Boot Starter Web. So these two dependencies are the bare minimum that you need in order to get up and running with GraphQL. All right, and then by default you get these for testing. So testing GraphQL, Webflux, and Spring Boot Starter Test in here. All right, so when you choose these two, this comes with it, right? But you should get all of this by default. And now let's together in here just open up GraphQL application and let's try to run this. So I'm gonna run this, and if this runs for you with no errors, then it means that everything is working, and you can see that we have Tomcat started on port 8080. All right, let me stop this. And this is pretty much the starter branch. Next, let's go ahead and get up and running with GraphQL. If you're not really sure about Spring Boot, I do have this course which was completely revamped, and it's about 10 hours long, and it covers Spring Framework, Spring Boot, Spring Data API, Spring Security, Java, basically Terminal, and then IntelliJ. So these are the tech stack used in the course, but it covers all of this. So development, environment setup, Spring Boot annotations, the core Spring Framework concepts, web configuration and management, Spring MVC, JSON handling, Java Bean validation, exception handling, Spring Data API, REST client, task execution, dynamic application configuration, logging, actuator, security, and finally packaging and deployment. And we're always improving these courses, so we're going to introduce AI very soon onto this course. But basically it's about 10 hours long, and I recommend you to enroll if you're really not sure about Spring Framework and Spring Boot. All right, I think this is pretty much it. Let's begin our journey. So for this project, what we want to build is this application here, where we have the API, which will basically be based off GraphQL. We're going to have a service class, and the database in here is going to be an in-memory database, but this is following the N-tier architecture. Now, the idea is that clients will use the GraphQL query language to request some data, and then we'll return them a JSON object like so in here. And you'll see how all of this will work in a second. Now, when it comes to GraphQL, we have to define the schema in here. So this is the schema in here. And this schema right here represents the kind of object that you can fetch from your service, including all of its fields. So in here, we have the type query. So this is basically what the client can query against our service, basically. And then here, these are the types. So we have author in here with all of these fields. So ID, and then name, or actually first name, last name. And we also have a book in here, which has an ID, name, page count, and then author in here, which references this type in here. All right. So basically the schema basically is just a file that contains what the client can query, including all of the fields for the types themselves, right? Cool. So let's break this down step by step, and then you'll see how all of this works. So in here within the starter branch, what I'm going to do is, let me just close all of these fields, or tabs, my bad. And what I'm going to do here is, so basically I'm going to create a new branch. So here I'm going to click on start, or I can actually open the terminal in here, and I'm going to say git checkout and then main, because I want to push all of this stuff against main, right? So the starter branch just contains the starter code, and then everything will be of the main branch. All right, cool. So I need to say checkout -b instead, and then main, and then I'm going to say git and then branch dash and then capital M and then main. So this will be the main branch. There we go. Cool. Now, if you want to learn more about Git, I've got a 10+ hours course just on Git teaching you all of this, and I'll leave the link under the description of this video. Cool. So now what we're going to do is define our schema. Now, under resources, GraphQL, create a new file, and this file will be named as schema.graphql and then s. Press enter, and here I'm going to cancel this. I'm not going to add this. I'll add these files to version control later. Cancel, and if you get a pop-up saying that to install the extension for GraphQL, go ahead and install, and then this file should be recognizable by IntelliJ, and then whatever you type in here will be highlighted for you. All right, so what we want to do is we want to create a type in here. Let's just create a type. So we're going to say type, and this type will be book. So our application will basically allow clients to search for books in our application. So here, let's define the structure of a book. So a book will have an ID. The type of it is ID. So this right here is a data type for GraphQL ID, and let's also say name colon, and then this will be of type string. Let's also define the page count for a book, so page count, and this will be an integer, so int. And for now, this will be enough. We'll add a second type in a second, but this is it. All right, cool. Now that we have this type in here, let's create one other type, and this type in here, we're going to call it query. And this is what the clients are able to query from our service. And for us, we're going to have one query called books in here, and this will return, so this will return a list of books. So we'll add more queries in here, so one to fetch a book by ID, but for now we just want to have this one called books, and it will return a list of books, which is this type in here. And this is pretty much it for this schema. We'll come back to this, as I said, but for now, let's move on. All right, now that we have the schema, what I want to do is to create the model for this book in here in Java using records. So let's open the com.amigoscode.graphql, new Java class, choose record, and we're going to call it as book. Press enter, and this is our book record. And what I want to do is I want to take this schema.graphql s and then just put it right underneath. So you see the type called the book, and here you can see that we have the ID, name, and then page count. So we want to define all of these within this record. So I'm going to say integer, so this is data type, ID, comma, and then string, name, comma, and then integer, page, and then count. So this right here represents this type in here in GraphQL. Now for us, we're not going to connect to a real database because I just want to show you how to build an API using GraphQL. So what we're going to do is within this book record in here, so within this book record, let me close this for now. We're going to have the data in it. So basically we're going to bundle both the database as well as the service right within the record itself. All right. So let's go back. Here I'm going to say public and then static list of and then books. And here I'm going to say books equals to and then arrays dot as and then list. And here we're going to add a new and then book. And here let's just basically have the ID of 1 and then name this will be, let's just say Quran in here. And then we need to define the page count, which is 6, 0, and then 4. Cool. I'm going to add comma and then command D a couple of times. And here let's just add, I don't know, 4 books. So 2 and then 3 and then 4. And here I'm going to say Harry and then Potter. I don't know how many pages, but I don't know, something like, I don't know, 600 or 700. I don't know how big it is. And then I'm going to add another book called Full Bar. Full Bar has, I don't know, 100 pages. And then here, let's just say that we have a Spring Boot. And this has 344 pages. All right, so this is the list itself, and this is pretty much it. So we'll add the ability of fetching a book by ID later, but let's just take baby steps for now. All right, so we have the model or the book itself, and then we have the data in here that contains all of the books. Next, let's go ahead and implement the controller that allows us to fetch all of these books. Now let's go ahead and define the controller that will enable us to perform requests to our API. So let's create a new and then here class, and this will be book and then controller. And in here, so if you've done some Spring Boot before, you must be aware of REST controller and whatnot. But here, all we're going to do is just say controller, just like that. And let's define the method. So here, public, and then we want to return a list of books. So list, and then this will be book in here. And then what we need to do, in fact, is in our schema, have a look. We have books, and this returns a list of books. So this name right here, books, has to be the exact same name. So let's just go back to the book controller. So books in here. And what we're going to do is simply say return book dot and then books. So book.books is basically this right here, which is our array. All right. So if I go back in here, this is pretty much it. Well, not quite. So we need to use one annotation that basically binds this method in here to our schema. So here we're going to say at and then query and then mapping. So query from org.springframework.graphql. There we go. So this right here now is mapped to this query, and it means that once we start querying our data using GraphQL, it will use this method right here to fetch all the books. And to be honest, this is pretty much it for our controller. Next, let's go ahead and enable GraphQL UI and then perform a query to see whether all of this is working. Catch me in the next one. All right, now that we basically have pretty much everything configured, the last thing that we need to do is to open application.properties, and in here we're going to enable the property. Oops, if I can type in here. Something is weird, so my keyboard I think ran out of battery. All right, let me use the other keyboard. Cool, so it's gonna be weird. And in here we need to search for GraphQL. So GraphQL, and I think it's this guy right here. So this is the path basically, but we need to enable it. So this guy, so GraphQL, and then Graphy, and then QL, and then enabled, which is by default in here. And you can see that if you want to change, for example, the path, you can change it by using this. But for us, what we're going to do is just using the UI, and then we're going to say true. All right. Now, this will enable us now to query data against our application. So let's start the application. So in here, I don't know why I've got two. So let me just delete all of these configurations. So delete this one as well. And let's just run the main class. And if everything works fine, we should see that basically everything is up and running. And have a look, GraphQL endpoint in here. This is the one that applications will use. So /GraphQL, but also if we navigate to localhost, so let's just open up a web browser. So here, let's just say localhost and then 8080 / and then GraphQL, or I think it was Graphy. And then QL. Press enter, and sure enough, everything is up and running. So if I zoom this so you can see things properly, and there we go. So this is basically the UI that allows us to interact with our application by writing, validating, and testing GraphQL queries. All right, so if you managed to get this far, thumbs up. Next, let's go ahead and learn how to write some queries. If you navigate to the official page for GraphQL, there's a section on queries and mutation, and this basically explains how to query a GraphQL server. Here's a very simple example. So if I try to put this, bigger, so you see exactly just like that. So have a look. So here, basically, you define an object, and then you ask for the root level, so hero, for example, and then here you ask for all the fields, and then this is what you get back. So you get back data, and then hero, and then basically the object that you have requested. So if I scroll down, here's another example where an hero can have friends, right? And from friends, you get just the names. So you get the name of the hero in here, and then friends as an array in here. And then because you just asked for the name, you only have one name field in here, or property, and then the value. So you can see how this works. All right, so also you can pass arguments, and you'll see this in a second. So we're going to use arguments as well. So you say human, and then ID, and then basically the argument, and then you want to fetch the name, height, so on and so forth. And you can see this is what you get back. All right, let's go back to our GraphQL UI. And in here, what we want to do is we want to create a query. So what I want to show you actually is if you click on this button, you can see in here, so GraphQL schema provides a root type for each kind of operation. So currently we have one root type, which is query, and here we can basically query for books, and you can see the name, and then this is the type, and the type is ID, name, page count. All right, so if I go back in here, click on books, actually it's the same thing. And yeah, so you can see basically the data types for it as well. And currently it's very simple, but you should see how this will evolve. All right, so in here, in this console in here, so this is where we can write our queries. So let's just delete everything, and we're going to write our very first query. So let me just zoom in, and I can remove this. We don't need that. So here, what we need is, or what we have, sorry, is books. And then within books in here, we can fetch. So we can fetch D. So remember what we have. So if I open, we have a query, books, and then we have the ID, name, and page count. So if I hide this, so here, let's just say that we want the name. So if I execute the query, have a look what we have. So we have the result, which came back, data, and then books in here. So this is what we queried, and then name Quran, and then name Harry Potter, name Fullbar, and then Spring Boot. So let's also say that we want the page count, right? So we want to get the page count and also ID. Run this, and you can see that now we are basically asking for the data. So we are querying the data based of the schema types in here. So we don't have to change the backend whatsoever to include new fields and whatnot. We just ask for what we want. So this is pretty much the gist. So if I was to, let's just say that I want to get rid of that, and then let's just query for something that doesn't exist. So foo, for example, run, you can see that invalid syntax. So this doesn't work. But what we can do is, if I put it back, you can see that this works. All right, this is pretty much how to kind of query, and I'll show you how to pass arguments in a second. This is all for now. If you have any questions, drop me a message. Otherwise, catch me on the next one. All right, so you've seen that we can basically get all the books, but usually you want to have the ability of getting a book by ID, for example. So how do you do it? Well, let's go back to IntelliJ, and in here, let's go to schema, and we're going to define a query. So I'm going to say book by ID, and this will receive the ID in here, and the type of it is an integer, just like that. And we're going to return a book. So colon and then book. All right, now let's define the controller. So take this name, open up the book controller, and then here we're going to say at, and then query mapping, and then this will say public, just a book, and paste the name, and we're going to receive the book ID. So say integer, and then book, and then ID, or let's just say ID, and we need to annotate this to at and then argument from GraphQL, just like that. And what we're going to do is we're going to say return, and then books, or and then book dot book by ID, and then pass the ID. All right, let's create this within the book record. So let's just create a method in there. So public static get book by ID, and this will be simple. We're going to return, and then books dot, and then stream dot, and then filter. We're going to filter a book where the book or b dot id dot equals to the ID that we receive, dot find first, dot or else, and then throw. Or actually not even throw, let's just say or else get, and then null. So I think we can actually say that this will return an optional, but let's just leave this as is, and this is it. So we have the controller in here, and you can see that the method now works, and we're good to go. Now let's restart the server. There we go. Open up the GraphQL UI, and in here, if I query for books, this still works. But now if I want to query by the book ID, and now if I want to query by the book ID, I could just say book, or I think let's just reload this first so we get auto completion. So book by ID. There we go. Cool. Now here we can pass the ID and then colon, and then here we can pass the ID that we want. So we want to find the book by this ID, and then run, and you can see that now we have one book, and it's the Quran. All right, so you can see how this is powerful. So if I say book and then 3, or actually 4, we get Spring Boot. If I say 5, for example, we get null. Now let's actually change this to an optional just to see whether this works. So an optional would look like this. So optional of type book, and let's change this guy as well to return an optional. So optional of type book, and we can get rid of this guy right here. So find first or else null. This is simpler. Reload. Let's go back, and in here let's just send, and you can see that this still works. So if I was to say 3, for example, this works. So this is much better. And there you have it. Now we can query by ID. And obviously you can pass as many arguments and define many parameters that you want. And you just have to say at query. And all you have to do is inside of your controller, so book controller, just define as many arguments that you want, map it to the corresponding data type, and off you go, perform your logic. All right, next, let's have a relationship between books and authors. All right, so you've seen that we have the book in here, and also we have 2 queries, book by ID as well as books. And what we want to do is we want to have a relationship between books and authors. So let's learn how to do this. Back to IntelliJ, and in here, let's open up the schema, and let's define the type. So type, and we're going to say author, and this author will have an ID of type ID, and let's just define the name of type string. All right, now what we need to do is say that the book as an author, just like that, and the type will be author, just like this. Now obviously we have to do some work, so let's define the author record. So author, this will be a record, and the author, so again we'll have the integer ID and then string name. Let's add a couple of authors, so public static, and then this will be a list of author, and we're going to say authors, just like that, array or arrays dot equals to arrays dot as list, and then new, and then author. We're going to pass the ID, so let's just say 1. The ID will be, or sorry, name will be Mama Samba, and let's have another author, and this author will be called, so with ID 2, let's just say Jamila, for example. All right, so we have 2 authors, and let's basically take the exact same method in here. So to get an author by ID as well, because we might need that. Oops, not there, but within author, paste that, change this to author, and then change the data type, and then the name. So get author by ID. All right, so hopefully now this makes sense, and this is it. Now, obviously, we need to change the book as well. So here we want to include the ID for the author. So I'm going to say integer and then author ID. And this has to be a valid author ID. All right. So here, let's just say 1, for example, and then 2, and then 1, and then 2, just like that. Oh, actually, sorry, this cannot be me, right? So this is not me. So let's just add another author, and let's just go back to the author in here, and here I'm gonna say new, or let me just duplicate this just like that, 3, and this is the author for the Quran. So this is serious, and here I'm gonna say 3. So this is much better, and we're good to go. Now you might think that this will work, so let me just refresh this, the server, and then go to the query, and you can see a mapped field, book, and an author, right? So right out of the bat, it's telling you that this isn't mapped. So the field is not mapped whatsoever, the author field. So if I was to query this in here, send the request, you can see that we don't get any authors in here. So to map the author, what we need to do is the following. Back to IntelliJ, I'm gonna hide that, go to book controller, and in here, we need to have a method. So within the book controller, we need to have a method that gets the author from the book. So let's just say public in here, and then author, and let's just have an optional actually. So optional of author in here, and then I'm going to say author. There we go. And we're going to pass the book, and from the book we're going to return author dot get author by ID, book dot, and then author ID. All right, now what we need to do is we need to add one annotation at, and then this will be schema and then mapping. So this now will basically map the author to our schema. So it's no longer a query mapping, right? Because we're performing the query. So we have 2 queries, books and book by ID, but within these queries in here, we need to map the author to the schema. All right, so this is schema mapping, and it's able now to basically for each book get the corresponding author. All right, let's reload, and there we go. So now you can see that unmapped fields, nothing. So which means that it's going to work, I think. So let's just give this a go. All right, now if I send the request, this doesn't work, and it doesn't work because we need to include, we need to say we want the author, and then within author, we can basically fetch a few things. We can fetch the ID, and we can fetch the name. All right, send that request, and you can see that now we have the name of the book, page count, ID, author, and we pull the ID as well as the name, and everything is working beautifully. If I also fetch all books, so books, send the request, you can see that everything is working beautifully. Now obviously, so before we didn't include this, but let me just prove that to you that this was not working. Let me go back. So if I was to remove this schema mapping and then refresh, and you can see that now we get the error, which is a mapped author. Go back in here, send the request, and you can see that author is null. All right, let me put it back and then reload the server. Back again in here, send the request, and you can see that it works. This is pretty much how you get up and running with GraphQL. If you have any questions, drop me a message. Otherwise, catch me on the next one. Now, what I want to show you actually is that GraphQL is really powerful, because if you were to have an API where you kind of have one endpoint that gives you a list of books in here, you basically need to send a separate request if you were to ask, for example, for authors, or if you wanted to get a bunch of different information from the server, you would need to send multiple requests. Whereas with GraphQL, you can basically ask for what you want in one single request. So in here, you see that we have books and then ID, name, page count. So this is an array of books. Now you could technically do something like this. I could just basically have another query that basically, so one that gives me books, the other one that gives me the ID for each book, and the other one that gives me the page count. So books and then page and then count. And if I run this, have a look. So it's actually smart enough to know that basically I'm trying to combine everything together. But what we could do is, if I will say in here ID, for example, and for example, if I was to now, so I can combine this right here. So give me all the books. So let's just put page count in here, page count. But also I can send another query in here. So I could say book by ID and then grab the ID in here, colon, and then 4, for example. There we go. And I can include all of these fields. Or if I just want name, for example, right? Or maybe just the author, right? So author and then name. So now you can see that, depending on whatever the server has, I can just request what I want in one single request. So this is the power of GraphQL. Whereas with normal REST APIs, you kind of expect the server to have all of these endpoints, and then you'd need to call endpoints individually, or the server would actually need to accommodate whatever response the client needs. And you can see that in here, there's none of that. So if I send the request, you can see here we have books, and then we have book by ID in here, and this just has the author in here. And if you wanted to have, for example, transactions, basically anything that the server has available for the client, you could just request in one single request. All right, so hopefully you can see the power of GraphQL. And if you have any questions, drop me a message. Otherwise, catch me on the next one. Now, what I want to do is show you how to test this controller in here so that we can basically make sure that we are fetching the right number of books from our GraphQL server. Now in here, if you're not too familiar with testing, don't worry, because I just want to make sure that we kind of test this a little bit. And I do have a course that focuses just on testing. Here within IntelliJ, what we can do is to generate a test, we can go to code, or where is it? So I usually don't use this. So I think is it refactor? Not refactor. Is it code generate? There we go. And then test. So I usually don't use this. I just say Shift Command T, and then it just opens for me. And you can see the keyboard shortcut down here. All right, so we're going to generate a test. This will be JUnit 5. Just leave everything as is and just tick books in here. Cool. So I'm going to say can get and then books, just like that. All right, we can remove this import statement. It's not going to be needed. And we need to use this special annotation called @ and then GraphQL test. And we want to test the book and then controller.class. Cool. Now, what we can do is in here, we can auto wire. So let's just basically say private and then GraphQL tester. And this will give us the ability of, so let's just say auto wire. And this will basically give us the ability of executing queries. All right. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to create a document. So in here, let's open up test, and under test, we're going to right click and then new. And then what we're going to do is directory and choose resources in here. There we go. And under resources, create a new folder or directory, and you're going to call it graph and then QL dash and then test. And within here, we can create, so we can create a file. And here, let's just call it as books.graphql. Now, within this file, basically, we can have our query, which we can then use within our test. So here, let's just say query and then books. And what we're going to do is, if I basically start using, you can see that we can get all the queries that we have. So let me just go back to the GraphQL UI, and in here, let's just grab all of this. So all of that, go back and paste that. And now we're getting the exact same result that we got from the UI. All right, now let's go back to our test. And within this can get books, we're going to basically use this and say GraphQL tester dot, and then here we can actually pass a document name. So the document name is this one, books. So let's just say books, just like that. And let me just put this on a new line. So you can actually pass a string, a raw string, which is the exact same thing as this. But obviously having this as a string is not really nice. That's why we created this file. So let me just go back. And here now I can say dot and then execute. And we're going to say paths or path, my bad. The path will be book or books, which is this guy in here. All right. So this is the query. This is the books in here, the path that we're looking for. And I'm going to say dot and then entity and then list. So this gives us a list of books. So book dot and then class. And this will be a simple test that we're going to check whether the size, so dot has and then size. And I know that for a fact there's 4 books. Just like that. So if we go to book in here, so book class, so this right here gives us 4 books. And if I go back and then run this, or actually the server is not up and running. So let's just start the server. There we go. Up and running, hide this and then run it. And you can see that we have 1 book, 2, 3, and then 4, right? And this is what we are testing in here. All right, cool. So let's just run this test. So just click on this file and then run. And hopefully we should get a test that passes. Hooray. And you can see that this was quite cool. Now, obviously, if I change this from 4 to 3, for example, this will fail. There we go. It fails. And if I scroll down, it just complains about the size. So somewhere we should have the size. There we go. Size 3. All right. Cool. So let me just undo this. And this is basically a simple test, but obviously you can, start testing more complex scenarios depending on your application. But I just want to show you that you have this GraphQL tester, which you can use. In a second, I'll show you the documentation where you can get more information about this, but this is pretty much the gist. So if I just run this test again, just to make sure it passes, hooray, and job done. That's all for now. Catch me on the next one. All right, if you want to deploy your API and start using it, most likely you're going to be using it over HTTP. So this is the most common choice for client-server protocol when using GraphQL, because of this when using GraphQL. Now, you can read some of these best practices in here, but basically there's 2 ways that you can send requests. You can either send a GET request in here, and basically you send your query like this in here. And you can see that basically you say your API. So in our case, this is GraphQL in here. And actually, one thing that I forgot to mention is that your URL endpoint, it's usually /GraphQL. So you saw that the UI that we've been using, so this one right here, so this one sits under, so if I show you, sits under graph and then I and then QL, and it's not GraphQL basically, there's an I in here if you can see, right? So this I in here. Now, if you were to build, for example, a React application or a mobile application that wants to connect to this API, you kind of just send the request to / and then graph. So if I just in here, so I'm going to say basically GraphQL without the I. All right. And then here you can say question mark and then query, and then the query would be equals to, and then basically whatever it is in the documentation. But I'll show you this in a second. All right. So let me show you the documentation. So you can use the get request, and this is what I was going to do in here. But this here is not really good because if you have a long query, then you can see it's going to be really difficult for you to basically read. So instead, what you can do is to use a post request. So within the request body in here, you can basically send this payload where the query looks like this, and it's much easier. All right. And what you get as a response is data and then errors. So data basically containing your information that you request, and then errors, any errors that might occur. All right, cool. So what we're going to do is first I'm going to show you how to use Postman, and then I'll show you how to build a React application that will consume the API. So for now, catch me on the next one. Another way that we can test our GraphQL endpoints is by using Postman. So Postman is an API client which you can use to test, and it's quite powerful. And the way that you can use it to test your GraphQL server is in here. You can see that you can send an HTTP request, WebSocket, Socket.io, and GraphQL request. So you can either click here or new. So once you have Postman installed, just click, and you can add this to favorites if you want to, and HTTP. So these are the ones that I use the most. So GraphQL, and in here the URL is localhost. So the same URL that we've been using, :8080. Now you saw that the UI, so the GraphQL UI that we've been using, sits on in here. So if I take this full screen, you can see that this is GraphQL and then path GraphQL. Now this is just this UI client here that we can use, but in order for us to actually interact with the API, it's as follows. So here is going to be / and then GraphQL, and you should see that immediately it actually starts to get all the types for us. You can see that query and then books, book by ID. These are the only ones that we get. So if I change this to path, I think it just, so if I just change the path here and then reload, you see that cannot load GraphQL schema, right? So if I remove this and then try again, and you can see that this works. And in here, remember, when you start the server, you can see GraphQL endpoint HTTP post in here. So this is the HTTP verb, and this is the path. So this / GraphQL is what clients will need to use in order to access your API. All right. Now, if I show you within IntelliJ, so if we basically hide this and then go to application.properties, in here, if I search for GraphQL path, have a look. So this is a default path. So if I choose that and then say /API /GraphQL, and here I'm going to reload this, go back to Postman. Now if I send the query, this doesn't work. It's a 404 not found. But here, if I now say API /GraphQL, send the request, and this time it works, right? But we didn't query anything because we have to send a payload. So here, if I select books, so this is the query in here. If I click on query, now you can see that we get 200 status code, and look, our books in here. So 4 books that we have. So this is pretty much how you use Postman to query your GraphQL server. Now let me go back, and I'm going to leave this as a default. So / and then GraphQL. Reload. And let's just make sure that things work. So remove API from there, send the query, and it works. We can also send a query to get book by ID. So select this one, and we need to pass an integer. So let's just say here number 2, and you can see how the query looks like. Send, and you can see that we have 1 book in here. All right, that's all for now. Catch me on the next one. Awesome. I'm glad you've made this far. As I said, I'm going to be publishing the next part of this video, which is going to be building the UI on top of this backend API that we built with GraphQL. And if there is anything that you want to see next, any content, any suggestions, go ahead and leave a comment down below. That's all for now. I'll see you in the next one. Assalamu alaikum.